We did the obstacle course, forced marches, target practice with M1s, M2s, 45s, crawled on our bellies under machine gun fire, practiced landings, seen here, survived cold weather training at Pickle Meadows in the Sierra Nevadas. Tex Downs can tell you all about that. He was stationed there after his tour with 3-5 in Korea. This is a picture of the doctors in my group, the 16th replacement draft. I went over with 5,000 Marines on the William Wiggle. There weren't a lot of happy grunts on that ship. We had abandoned ship drills, went through a North Pacific storm on Christmas Eve, which was on December 23rd because we crossed the date line that night. There were only a couple hundred men who felt like eating turkey that Christmas day. We were duly welcomed to the domain of the Golden Dragon by King Neptune and his minions from Davy Jones' locker, made to crawl naked through garbage and do other strange and horrible things. 19 days after shipping out from San Diego, we dropped anchor off Sok Cho Ri, which is not on this map, but was on the east coast above the 38th parallel, not too far south of Wonsan. An LST made 5 trips from beach to transport, taking 1,000 men at a time. This is Dr. Jim Kleckner with his 54-pound pack, M2 carbine, web belt, canteen, and all the other stuff we carried like the rest of the Marines. It was very quiet on the deck of that LST. On the beach, we were all handed 60 rounds of ammunition for our weapons and were carried into the mountains of North Korea. We went in canvas-covered trucks up to the 1st Marine Division headquarters. The dog was Mike and the driver, Steve. Before the war, this part of Korea was one of the most isolated in the world. No roads penetrated these mountains. Now, Army and Marine engineers had pushed roads up and around and over and through. Sometimes you could stand on one level and look straight down at the road below. I was assigned to the 3rd Battalion of the 5th Marines and arrived on this road. The 3rd Battalion was stretched out between hills 751 and 556, just forward of hill 854. Just weeks later, we went into reserve, and when we went back online, we were on hill 812, under the guns of the Chinese up on hill 1052, Luke de Gook's castle. This is what greeted me on January 2nd, 1952. We called it Mercy Row, the rear aid station, tents of the doctors, corpsmen, and the chaplain. And seen here from a different angle are the tents of H&S Company during morning sick call. We had 10 to 15 corpsmen in rear aid, which was sometimes too many when the lines were quiet, and sometimes too few when we got into trouble. This should be familiar to a lot of you. H&S Company of 3-5 on the back side of Hill 854 in January 1952. We also had a forward aid station and a bunker in the trench system in George Company. This trench system extended pretty much along the entire line from east to west coast and was about 100 miles long as a crow flies at the waist of Korea. The line was real quiet the first time I was up there with my camera, so like a dumb fool I stood up to take this picture and was rewarded with sniper fire. This is what it looks like to a machine gunner from his bunker on the busy side of the ridge. Our forward aid station was in this bunker, and I lived there for short periods of time with 2 corpsmen from H&S Company. Each platoon had 2 corpsmen, so we had 18 per line company. I alternated between forward and rear aid with Dr. Bob Kimball, seen here with Jeep ambulance driver John Gumpert, coming back to H&S after his stint in forward aid. Gump had been a machine gunner with 3-5 and took part in the fall offensive on the Punch Bowl and was wounded there for the 3rd time. The brass wanted to make a rear echelon pogue out of him and send him back to Yongdong Po or Weijongbu or somewhere, but he persisted and got reassigned to H&S of 3 and 5 as my Jeep ambulance driver. Bill Meadows was our cracker box ambulance driver, seen here with Gump at a Bailey Bridge, thrown across the Soyanggang by Army engineers. Many of you here will know these men, roughly from left to right: Captain Diamond, CO of Item Company; Captain Clary, CO of Howe Company; Major Broughton, S5, the battalion executive officer; Captain Lau, CO of Weapons Company; Lieutenant Colonel McLaughlin, S6, the battalion commanding officer; and Lieutenant Schuster, Charlie Schuster, the S4, our supply officer. Some more of our headquarters and service company officers. I'm on the far left, then Lieutenant Bill Payne, S3, I think, the battalion operations officer; Captain Eddie Abner, a pilot; and forward observer, Bob Kimball, the other battalion surgeon, Jack Murnane, pilot and FO, and Kneeling Emmett, our camp mascot and worker. When anti-guerrilla patrols went out back of our lines, I sent 2 corpsmen with them from H&S Company. This is a patrol coming back after a fruitless search for guerrillas. The guerrillas were South Koreans who sympathized with the communists, or North Koreans who had infiltrated the lines and played havoc with our communications, cutting commo wires and doing other nasty tricks. This is a mortar platoon moving along a road paralleling the Soyang-gang. Corpsmen were assigned to weapons company and moved and lived with these Marines. Our copter strip was a flat, brushed-out area with vermilion flags at the 4 corners. For night evacs, 4 corpsmen stood at the corners with flashlights, which they switched on when we heard the copter coming, then turned off when the pilot switched on his landing light. We rarely got a negative to a request for night evacuations. You may know that the Army never did them. We could always hear it coming, and in daylight could see it. The little bell settled onto the pad with a flapping sound that I heard hundreds of times and will never forget. Even to this day, a copter going by overhead always makes me think of Korea. The corpsman ran in under the whirling blades with a stretcher. The patient was carefully transferred to the pod. The pilot put sandbags in the other pod when we had just 1 evac to balance the copter. He lifted off the ground a few feet, spun in midair, tipped forward, and took off for a medical company or a hospital ship. We went into reserve for 3 weeks at Camp Tripoli, about 10 miles back of the lines. I saw civilians for the first time, these merchants in a small village, and a young lad who stepped off the road and yelled in English, "USMC number 1. I called back, "KMC Sheil," which I was told meant Korean Marines number 1. I must have been right because the boy grinned broadly and clapped his hands excitedly. While there we held a memorial service for the men who hadn't come back with us. We marched in full battle dress from company bivouac out onto the flat riverbed of the Soyang-gang. The names of the dead were read as we stood in company formations, and then the bugler sounded taps. There were not just a few moist eyes in the ranks of those tough young Marines. In March of '52, the 1st Marine Division was transferred from the East Coast to the West Coast, where we straddled the neutral corridor which ran north and south from Panmunjom to Munsan-ni. Munsan is about 25 miles north of Seoul. We went across the mountains on the east coast to the much lower hills north of Seoul. We traveled in 2 serials strung out for miles, our sick bay Jeep ambulance marked for easy identification. I remember looking down the barrel of this artillery piece for many hours. I remembered my weapons training at Pendleton and hoped these 11th Marines had cleared their weapon. We camped out en route in a riverbed, built a fire to warm us, and heated our Charlie rations. Yeah, that's 2 doctors you see there, guys. Bob Kimball and I washing our skivvies in a small stream. Chief Hospitalman Alexander shaved in the rear-view mirror of the cracker box. The Korean Marines held the Kimpo Peninsula, so they were on our left flank. This is Colonel Nan, second from the left. U.S. Navy Chaplain Father Barlick on the far left. Dr. Young Kok Lee in the T-shirt, more on him in a minute. And 4 KMC officers. The Commonwealth Division was on our right flank, the Aussies, Brits, Canadians, Indian ambulance teams, Turks, and a few other assorted nationalities. Spring was coming, and being out of the mountains, it was downright warm. Our rear aid station was in a pyramidal tent, sandbagged and strong-backed. Monthly replacement drafts rotated men home after about a year. These are 3 Navy corpsmen headed for home from 3-5, hospital men Nemec, Needleman, and Kuhn. We sometimes had religious services in H&S Company when the lines were quiet. This is Navy Chaplain Elliott leading the service, and yours truly at the 3-octave pump organ. Off-duty corpsman Stein, Young, and Teeter played football with ambulance driver Bill Meadows and Dr. Kimball. Dr. Rogers, a dentist, came up from a forward hospital company, examined the troops. Those that needed work done were sent back to Abelmed, which was about 10 miles to the rear. Well, that was a world that wouldn't have been too dissimilar to the one you guys knew, and I think maybe that's my point, that although we Navy medical people had a specific role to play, we lived a life pretty much like you did, at least of those those of you who were with 3-5 after November of 1951. But let's go to a world that most of you never saw, and the rest of you wished you'd never seen. For the Army, it was the MASH, Mobile Army Surgical Hospital. For the Marines, it was the medical company. After 6 months with 3-5, I rotated back to E Company, nicknamed Easy Med. Unlike the infantry battalions, the 1st Medical Battalion was composed of 5 companies. Easy, at Mun San Ni, was about 4 miles behind the left flank of the 1st Marine Division. Dog was behind the Korean Marines on the Kimpo Peninsula. Charlie behind the right flank of the 1st Marine Division. Baker was on paper only, and Able Med was 10 miles to the rear. Able Med was the administrative center as well as the hospital for the internists and GPs who took care of non-surgical medical problems and acted as a holding company for the wounded who could be returned to the front line for duty. Our administrative staff at Easy Med worked in this Korean house. A few miles from Easy Med was the bombed-out Freedom Gate Bridge and a temporary bridge alongside it across the Imjing River. The United Nations peace negotiators lived in boxcars on the rail line to Seoul, which was 25 miles south. Almost every day their convoy of jeeps crossed the river on this bridge and drove up the road through our lines to Panmunjom. Mun San Ni was the site of the war's last jump. 3,500 men from the 187th Airborne had dropped there on March 23rd of 1951. This was while the Marines were still in the mountains to the east. Easy Med was a full-service hospital. Most of our work was on WIAs, but I took out a couple of hot appendices and once sewed up the ruptured bladder of our division surgeon when he was thrown from a jeep. The major operating room was in the Quonset. The minor rooms and wards were in the squad tents clustered around it. On the hillside across the way are the tents of the Marine security guards and the corpsmen. There were about 200 men on this site, doctors, corpsmen, lab and x-ray techs from the Navy, cooks, truckers, security, maintenance, and so forth from the Marines. In front of Easy Med were Tay Doc San, seen here, Reno, Carson, Vegas, The Hook, Berlin, T-Bone, and of course Bunker Hill and Siberia. We regularly had a staff of about a dozen Navy doctors. I'm the one in the t-shirt. Most of these men were up on the line with battalions before coming back to Easy, so you might know them. In the front row are Gordon McKinney, Will Senders, Will Ascheid, Birney Dibble, and Jerry Weinberger. In the second row are Lou Shirley and Sam Dowdy. In the back are dentist Ed Hansen, surgeon Bill Ogle, and psychologist Don Carlisle. Dr. Frank Roach, now deceased, was a division psychiatrist. He was a friend of mine from Cook County Hospital days in Chicago. He didn't have much to do because the NP evac for the Marines was 2% of all casualties. In World War I, they called it shell shock. In World War II, they called it combat fatigue. In the Korean War, it was neuropsychiatric casualty, or NP evac for short. All were euphemisms for what happens to a guy when he's reached his tolerance under fire. The Army's rate ranged from 10 to 20%, depending on the outfit. In August of 1952, they needed a new commanding officer of Easy Med, so they promoted me to lieutenant senior grade and gave me the command. The billet rated a lieutenant commander, but tried to get one of them in a combat situation. So anyway, I got the job. I didn't know what the heck I was supposed to do with all the non-medical problems, you know, administrative duties, discipline, captain's mask, inspections, all that kind of military stuff. So the guy who really ran things was this man, Navy Warrant Officer George DePro. I don't have to tell you guys how often that happens throughout the services, and in civilian life too, for that matter. Our triage ward was in a squad tent at first, but later in 1952, with the lines fairly stable now, we got a prefab building. It was nice to have the room, but it was much hotter with a corrugated metal roof. Inside it looked like this. 2 steel rails ran the length of the building on either side. We placed the stretchers on them. Here's one scene with Dr. Young Kok Lee, interpreter Ree, and Corpsman Corbus, Holiday, and Flau. Don Flau was a superior corpsman, as I'd found out innumerable times up with 3-5, and I was immensely pleased when he followed me down to Easy Med. He had the most beautiful bare